Welcome back. This is part 2 of Unit 6 discussion of page structure and how the geometry of a page is used by artists in various ways to direct our eye to focus and emphasis, um, and to also to create consonant or even sometimes dissonant placements. So you can see how in this painting the corner-to-corner diagonal is not nearly as important as the organization in terms of thirds, right? Although certainly the diagonals are there and are being used in the composition. Also notice how the implied line, both the implied line of Jesus' gaze and his hand pointing, and the implied line of the light moving into the space, is one of the main things that moves our eye through and into the composition. Earlier I talked about Baroque composition. That might have been in class. And one of the things I mentioned, I'm going to restate that, is that one of the most common features of compositions in Baroque painting is the use of one dominant corner-to-corner diagonal, and then on the other side, not so much of an emphasis on corner-to-corners, but on a straight diagonal to a right angle of the. So if you imagine this being a single line, and then you imagine making a right angle from that line to the corner, it would be a diagonal going this way, and similarly a diagonal going that way. And as you can see in this painting, that pretty much falls into that pattern of classic Baroque composition perfectly. And then another thing that's very typical about Baroque compositions is that the organization is very geometric, but then on top of that organization, the line of the figures and the line of these shapes, right, of both the line, the contour line, but also of the light and dark shapes, is kind of like in a sinuous or languorous twisting and turning around those basic geometries, so that you have almost like two compositions in a way. One very structural, which everything is locked into, and then another which is more curvilinear and more slow, and so that also a little less rigid. We see the same thing here in the Raft of Medusa, which is not a Baroque painting by any means, but you can see kind of a thought about Baroque composition in Géricault's painting. And there are some aspects of it that are not Baroque. You know, like there's kind of like the immediacy, the figures kind of coming out to us, almost breaking the border in a way, like really coming towards our picture plane, and then the space of them, the distance of the space there. All of those things feel maybe a little bit more modern and less Baroque, but still, it does have one thing in common with Baroque, which is this kind of balancing between the geometric way of thinking about organizing composition, and then the more kind of curvilinear and slow way of organizing composition. Let's take a look at some. So that's a good diagrammatic showing of how that works, right? That in the basic geometry we have these two triangles, right, and that's the main organization. But then at the same time we have these big kind of looping arcs that meander through that geometry. I put this piece up there just because I'm a Tintin fan and because I thought it was funny. All right, we see the same kind of idea here in Delacroix's painting, Liberty Leading the People. Right, we have a triangular organization based off of the geometry of the page, but then within that triangular organization we have these very kind of more curvilinear, languorous kind of movements. As we get close to the 20th century, we start to see very different ways of thinking about composition. A flatter kind of way of thinking about composition, and a composition that is much more about tension and the hints of dissonance. So the tensions include like lines coming really close up to the edges of things, right? And the kind of the ambiguity of space, the tension of whether this foot is being overlapped by that counter or not, and the way these kind of like these arcs of the body remind fineness of the arc of the tub. So there's, but still there is a very kind of careful organization here. It's a different kind of way of thinking about geometry of page, but it is still very geometric. One, so far we've mostly been talking about consonants. Let's go back for a second, right? Organizations, right? Like this organization, this big, go back. This big organization here, right? That locks everything into place and makes all the placement of these things feel very right, composed. And because they feel right and composed, they feel like they're in the right place. But composition can be used for the opposite purpose as well. Remember, one of the things that's most, like when you place something right on a geometric location that we think is, a perfect location, it often has a sense of being perfectly placed. But if we place something very near that location, just slightly off from that location, right, like that doesn't quite go to center, right, and that doesn't quite go to a fourth or a third, right, these kind of breakdowns of geometry that are just a little bit off from perfect, and in Francis Bacon's case, purposefully off from perfect all the time, just this constant aiming for compositional decisions that are agitated and tense and dissonant. And you can create a very different kind of feel for your painting. There are other reasons why these paintings feel very disturbing. The imagery itself, of course, the contrast between some areas being very built up and other areas being really, really dry and flat. All of this also creates tension in his paintings, but a lot of the tension in the paintings is compositional. I think of Francis Bacon in some ways almost like the opposite of Poussin. We can see in a less rigid way in these two paintings that same kind of play with tension and consonance, like both consonance and dissonance going on. There's definitely more dissonance going on here in this Francis Bacon painting. The placement of that dog is just slightly agitated, just a little bit off, a little bit off from the perfect. We can see also a play between consonance and dissonance in 20th century paintings that are purely non-objective, such as like this Joan Mitchell painting here. And I wanted to end on this image just to kind of show that this way of thinking is something that lots of people notice and lots of people use in their work. And Annie Leibovitz, in her work, she's a commercial photographer, and she does a lot of pieces for what's that magazine I'm thinking about? But she does a lot of these kind of multi-page spreads with lots of figures, and she organizes them very much in these kind of classical, kind of Renaissance compositions, and you're also thinking about Baroque organizations, and you can really clearly see how geometric that thought is there. All right, that's the end of the lecture.